war is loud. It is the shriek of steel tearing steel, the concussion of artillery that rattles the bones, the desperate howling engines of planes locked in a death spiral. In the cold, gray expanse of the North Atlantic, the war had its own soundtrack, the rhythmic, methodical ping of Allied ASDIC. That single electronic pulse was a death knell for the German U-boat fleet. It was the sound of discovery, the sound of depth charges being primed. By 1943, the happy time was a distant memory. The hunters had become the hunted. The wolf packs were being decimated. Allied technology, radar, air cover, and especially sonar, had turned the tide. The Kriegsmarine was losing the most important battle of the war, and Admiral Dönitz knew it. He needed a miracle. He needed a weapon that could break the new rules of warfare. What he got was a man everyone thought was a lunatic. This is not the story of a U-boat ace with a high kill count. This is the story of an idea. It's the story of a reclusive genius, a wild inventor who cared nothing for protocol and everything for acoustics. A man who looked at the ocean not as a battlefield, but as a living, breathing entity. He promised the High Command not just a submarine, but a ghost. A weapon that could render the ping useless. A machine so silent it wouldn't just evade the Allies, it would terrify them. Welcome back to War Chronicles. If you believe the most fascinating histories are the ones hidden in classified files and forgotten workshops, you are in the right place. We tell the stories of the outliers, the rebels, and the impossible machines that changed the course of conflict. Before we submerge into this incredible true story, do us a favor and help our channel grow. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss one of these deep dives. If you appreciate this kind of content, give this video a like. It truly helps us. And finally, we want to know where our stories are landing. Let us know one thing in the comments below. What country and city are you watching from? We are always amazed to see our community span the globe. The story of the silent submarine begins not in the sterile steel and diesel world of the Kiel shipyards, but in the cluttered, dust-filled study of a man who seemed to belong to another century. Carl von Stoiber was not a soldier. He was a physicist, a bioacoustician, and by all military standards, an eccentric of the highest order. While other engineers in the Third Reich were focused on bigger guns, thicker armor, and faster rockets, von Stoiber was obsessed with one thing: the absence of sound. He was a tall, gaunt man with a shock of untamable gray hair, known for wearing mismatched socks and muttering to himself in the halls of the Naval Research Institute. He was brilliant, insubordinate, and largely ignored. His colleagues, proper men in crisp uniforms, called him Der Wilde, or the Wild One, a nickname spoken with a mixture of derision and, perhaps, a small flicker of fear. They saw him as a man lost in theoretical nonsense. His office was a testament to his obsession. It was less a military research hub and more a natural history museum. Hanging from the ceiling were anatomical models of porpoise skulls. On his desk, stacked precariously between complex equations on wave propagation, were books on whale migration and the skin texture of sharks. He believed the answers to naval supremacy were not in a factory, but in the deep ocean itself. This fixation made him a pariah. In 1943, the Kriegsmarine was a rigid, desperate machine. It was bleeding men. Grand Admiral Dönitz, a hardened submariner himself, demanded practical solutions, not academic daydreams. He needed U-boats that could be built yesterday. He needed more Type 7s, the workhorse of the fleet, to be pumped out of the docks to replace the catastrophic losses. The meetings were brutal. Officers, their faces grim and etched with fatigue, would present charts showing tonnage sunk versus U-boats lost. The red line of losses was climbing vertically, threatening to intersect and overcome the blue line of Allied shipping. When von Stoiber's turn came to speak, the atmosphere in the room would curdle. He didn't talk about torpedo loadouts or crush depth. He spoke of boundary layer adhesion, vortex-induced vibration, and the Lombard effect in cetaceans. He once spent 20 minutes explaining, with manic enthusiasm, how the porous, fatty tissue of a sperm whale's head was the most sophisticated sound dampening and focusing mechanism on the planet. An admiral, his patience snapped, famously slammed his fist on the table. "Dr. von Stoiber," he growled, "we are not building whales. We are building weapons of war. Your fantasies are wasting our time. The Führer demands results, not biology lessons." Von Stoiber was unfazed. He simply pushed his wire-rimmed glasses back up his nose and replied, in his quiet, precise voice, "Admiral, your weapons of war are floating coffins. They are screaming their presence to every destroyer from here to Newfoundland. You build a machine of steel, and the enemy hears a machine of steel. Their sonar is a hammer, and your U-boats are bells. Ping. Found. Boom. Gone. You are losing because you are loud." The whale. The whale is a 400-ton creature that can approach a squid in total darkness, in total silence, and the squid never knows it is there until it is too late. You want to hunt? You must learn from the hunter. You must become the ghost. I am not offering you a whale. I am offering you silence. The room was silent, but it was the silence of disbelief, not agreement. He was dismissed. His proposals stamped with impractical and filed away in a basement. For the High Command, the U-boat war would be won with wolf-pack tactics and sheer industrial output, not with the dreams of a madman. But von Stoiber did not stop. If the admirals wouldn't listen, he would go around them. He used a small, discretionary research budget intended for acoustic improvements, and diverted it entirely. He requisitioned a small, forgotten workshop at the edge of the shipyard, a place half ruined by an old Allied bombing raid. There, with a small team of engineers and technicians he had handpicked, men who were also considered difficult, dreamers and malcontents, he began his real work. They called his project Stille, or Silence. It was a skunkworks operation, hidden in plain sight, funded by accounting tricks. While the main docks roared with the 24-hour clangor of U-boat construction, von Stoiber's small shed was comparatively quiet. His primary obsession was the U-boat's skin. He knew that the sound of a submarine wasn't just its engine or its propellers. It was the entire hull. The water flowing over the steel plates, the rivets, the seams, it all created a distinct acoustic signature, a fingerprint that Allied sonar operators were trained to hear. The ping of the Aztec would hit this hull and bounce back clear as a bell. Von Stoiber wanted to create a material that wouldn't reflect the ping, but swallow it. He experimented with everything. Synthetic rubbers, composites of asbestos and foam, bizarre chemical polymers. His team would hang 10-foot steel plates from a gantry and submerge them in a massive test tank. From one side, a captured British Aztec transmitter would send out its pulse. On the other, a sensitive hydrophone would measure the echo. For months, the results were failures. Ping, ping, ping. The echo would return, loud and clear. The conventional coatings dampened it slightly, but not enough. It was frustrating, grueling work. The team worked in shifts, sleeping on cots in the workshop, their hands stained with chemicals, their ears ringing. But von Stoiber was tireless. He was fueled by an absolute, unshakable conviction. He told his team, "We are not trying to make the steel quiet. We are trying to make the water forget the steel is even there." The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A report on experimental radar-absorbent materials being tested by the Luftwaffe. Von Stoiber, in a flash of lateral genius, realized that the principles of absorbing an electromagnetic wave, radar, and a sound wave, sonar, were related. It was about impedance matching, tricking the wave into entering a material and then trapping it, converting its energy into tiny, negligible amounts of heat. He abandoned the simple foam rubbers and began designing a complex layered tile. The outer layer was a soft, porous rubber, designed to have an acoustic impedance similar to seawater itself. A sonar ping wouldn't bounce off. It would enter, believing it was still in the ocean. But beneath this welcoming layer was a second, much denser layer, filled with microscopic gas-filled cavities and non-parallel surfaces. When the sound wave, now trapped, hit this inner core, it would be scattered in 1,000 directions, dampened and absorbed, bouncing around inside the tile until its energy was spent. The echo that returned to the hydrophone was a fraction of the original. It was a ghost, a whisper, a blurred smudge that was almost indistinguishable from the background noise of the ocean itself. He had done it. He called his new material Schattenhaut, shadow skin. When he presented his findings again, he wasn't just a theorist. He had a 10-foot steel plate that, to the best sonar in the world, simply vanished. This time, the admirals listened. They were still skeptical, but the losses in the Atlantic were now so catastrophic that impractical solutions were suddenly on the table. Dönitz himself reviewed the data. He was a practical man, but he was not stupid. He could see the potential. He gave von Steuber a provisional green light. Not a fleet, not a production line. He was given one boat. It was a brand new Type 7C hull, U-997, pulled from the production line before its final fitting. This would be von Steuber's test bed. The regular shipyard workers were furious. They saw a perfectly good U-boat being handed over to Der Wilde and his band of misfits. The boat was moved to a sequestered, guarded dry dock. The work was slow, painstaking. The Schattenhaut tiles were not easy to apply. Each one, about a foot square, had to be glued to the hull with a special adhesive. The seams perfectly sealed. It was like tiling a bathroom, if the bathroom was a 200-foot steel shark and the tiles were top secret. The shipyard veterans scoffed. They said the tiles would rip off in the first heavy sea. They said the adhesive would fail in the cold. They called U-997 the rubber duck. Von Steuber ignored them all. He was a man possessed. He didn't just stop with the skin. He went inside the U-boat. He saw the submarine as a single resonant instrument. Every pump, every compressor, every generator, every ventilation fan was a source of noise. A standard U-boat was a factory. The crew had to shout to be heard. This noise didn't just stay inside. It radiated through the hull and into the water. A beacon for enemy hydrophones. Von Steuber attacked the noise at its source. He and his team began rebuilding U-997 from the inside out. They mounted the diesel engines, the electric motors, and the terrifyingly loud air compressors on what he called a floating deck. The entire assembly of heavy machinery was isolated from the pressure hull, resting on massive, custom-made rubber bearings and hydraulic shock absorbers. The vibrations were trapped, dampened before they could ever touch the steel skin of the boat. He redesigned the pipework, inserting flexible rubber joints to stop the thump-thump-thump of the pumps from traveling through the boat. He lined the bulkheads with sound-deadening cork and asbestos. The crew spaces became claustrophobic. The passageways even tighter, but they also became eerily quiet. The traditionalists were horrified. His modifications added weight, reduced speed, and took up precious space that could have been used for torpedoes or provisions. He was compromising the boat's fighting ability. Von Steuber's response was curt. What fighting ability does a dead U-boat have? The most important weapon on this boat is not the torpedo, it is the silence. But his final and most radical innovation was at the very back of the boat, the propellers. Propellers are the noisiest part of any submarine. As they spin, they create microscopic bubbles on the trailing edge of their blades, a phenomenon called cavitation. These bubbles collapse with a tiny pop, and at several hundred RPM. These millions of pops combine into a high-frequency hiss that a hydrophone can pick up from miles away. Von Steuber, inspired by the effortless, silent propulsion of a whale's tail, sought to eliminate cavitation entirely. He designed a new propeller. It wasn't the simple, brutal screw of a normal U-boat. It was a complex, five-bladed design with a radical, sweeping curvature and edges that were tapered to an almost impossibly fine tolerance. The blades were designed to move the water in a laminar flow, pushing it backward in a smooth, perfect vortex, rather than chopping through it. It was incredibly difficult to manufacture and balance, but in the test tank, the results were astonishing. At slow speeds, 3 to 5 knots, the silent running speed for an attack, the new propellers were almost completely silent. The cavitation hiss was gone. By the early spring of 1944, U-997 was ready. It no longer looked like a standard U-boat. It was wrong. The Schattenhaut tiles gave it a dull, matte black, almost organic appearance, like the skin of a shark. It seemed to absorb the very light that hit it. The crew assigned to it were nervous. They were veterans. Men pulled from survivors' crews, and they had a sailor's superstition. This boat felt cold. It didn't have the familiar oily, noisy thrum of a living machine. It felt like a tomb. Von Steuber himself, defying all protocol, insisted on being present for its sea trials. He stood on the conning tower, his wild hair blowing in the Baltic wind, a stopwatch in one hand and a hydrophone feed pressed to his ear. He was not a naval officer, but on this boat, his word was law. The first test was simple, a run against Germany's own listening posts. The boat submerged. The hydrophone operators at the station were told to track it. They heard nothing. They heard the distant churn of a patrol boat 5 miles away. They heard the flow of the tide, but U-997 running at 5 knots just 2 miles off their station was a hole in the ocean. The operators checked their equipment, rebooted their amplifiers, and reported a system failure. Von Steuber, hearing their panicked radio chatter, allowed himself a small, thin smile. The second test was more severe. A Kriegsmarine destroyer, Germany's best, was ordered to hunt U-997 in a designated patrol box. For 6 hours, the destroyer crisscrossed the area, its active sonar pinging relentlessly. The destroyer's captain was the best anti-submarine specialist in the fleet. He found nothing. He reported the U-boat had likely experienced a mechanical failure and returned to base. That evening, von Steuber's U-997 surfaced directly behind the destroyer, in its own wake, close enough to read the name on its stern. The wild inventor had just created the perfect predator, and now it was time to unleash it on the Allies. For a machine of war, U-997 began its first combat patrol with an almost religious stillness. She slipped out of the pens at La Palisse under the cover of a moonless night, a blacker shadow against the dark waters of the harbor. Her new Kapitän-Leutnant, Erich Reinhardt, stood on the bridge, his face a granite mask in the salt spray. Reinhardt was everything Karl von Steuber was not. He was a man of the sea, a pragmatist who had survived 3 years of war by trusting his instincts, his crew, and the unforgiving laws of physics. He had buried 2 crews already, lost a boat at the cost of his best friend, and had been given this thing as his new command. He hated it. He hated the faint chemical smell of the rubber adhesive that permeated the recycled air. He hated the way the deck plates didn't vibrate under his boots. It felt dead. He was a U-boat commander, and this was not a U-boat. It was a coffin wrapped in rubber, designed by a lunatic who was, at this very moment, sipping lukewarm coffee in the control room below, poring over blueprints. Von Steuber had insisted on joining the first patrol, a breach of protocol that Dönitz, in his desperation, had personally approved. The crew felt it too. They were veterans, the hard-bitten survivors of the iron coffins, and they were now trapped in the rubber coffin. The gallows humor did little to mask the genuine crawling fear. The first 48 hours were a symphony of nerve-shredding silence. In a normal Type 7, the world was a constant, deafening roar. The thrum of the diesels on the surface, the whine of the electric motors below, the hammering of the compressors, the groans and creaks of a hull under pressure. It was a living, breathing, noisy beast. The men lived in a state of industrial hell. But U-997 was different. When they submerged into the Bay of Biscay, an oppressive, unnatural hush fell over the boat. The floating deck mounts that von Steuber had designed absorbed the vibration of the electric motors so completely that the only sound was a faint, almost imperceptible hum. The men, conditioned by years of noise, found themselves whispering, as if in a church. They could hear the scrape of a fork on a tin plate in the mess, 2 compartments away. They could hear the hiss of the ventilation system, a sound previously drowned out by the machinery. They could hear the beating of their own hearts. This silence was not comforting. It was terrifying. It was the silence of the void, the silence of the deep ocean, and it felt like the boat was already a wreck, its engines dead, plunging into the abyss. Crewmen would jump, startled, when a valve was opened. The sonar operator, a young man named Hannes, kept ripping his headphones off, convinced his set was broken. "I hear nothing, Herr Kapitän," he would report, his voice strained. "Not the boat, not the screws. Nothing. Just the water." Reinhardt would just nod grimly, his knuckles white on the periscope handles. Their orders were simple. Proceed to the Black Pit, the Allied-controlled waters south of Iceland, and engage a convoy. But their real orders, the ones given to Reinhardt in a sealed envelope, were for von Stoiber. The boat was to seek out, not evade, an Allied hunter-killer group. It was to be a test, a sacrifice if necessary, to prove the concept. Reinhardt felt a cold rage at the thought. These were men's lives, not a laboratory experiment. On the third day, they found their quarry. Hannes, his face pale, pressed the headphones to his ears so hard they left red marks. Hydrophone contact, Herr Kapitän. His voice was a strained whisper. Multiple, many screw beats, heavy merchants, and pinging. I hear pinging. 3, maybe 4 escorts, bearing 030. This was it, the old dread, the familiar cold sweat. Returned to the control room. Men instinctively braced. Reinhardt gave the order, his voice tight. Rig for silent running. The commands were echoed. Rig for silent running. But it was a farce. They were already at silent running. Von Stoiber, who had been scribbling equations in a notebook, looked up, his eyes bright behind his spectacles. No, Kapitän, he said, his voice calm and academic. Not silent running, normal running. Maintain 4 knots. Bring her to periscope depth. Let them find us. Reinhardt stared at him as if he were insane. At 4 knots? To periscope depth? With 4 destroyers on the hunt? You will murder us all, Doctor. Von Stoiber stood and walked to the hydrophone station. He took a spare set of headphones and listened, a faint smile playing on his lips. They are hunting a Type 7, Kapitän. They are listening for a machine. We are not a machine. We are a patch of cold water. We are a shadow. Please, humor me. Periscope depth. Gritting his teeth so hard his jaw ached, Reinhardt gave the command. Periscope depth, slow to 4 knots. The boat ascended, agonizingly slowly. The pinging grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of death, the sound that had haunted their nightmares. Ping, ping, ping. It was a net of sound, closing in. Hannes, the sonar man, was trembling, his eyes shut. It's on us, Herr Kapitän. The pinging is right on top of us. He has us. He has us. Dive. Dive. Reinhardt gripped the steel ladder, bracing for the inevitable. But the attack didn't come. The ping was loud, yes, but Hannes, in his terror, was missing what von Stoiber was hearing. The return signal. There was none. The Aztec pulse was hitting the Schattenhaut, the shadow skin, and it was simply dying. It wasn't bouncing back. The British sonar operator on the destroyer above, HMS Harrier, was frowning. He heard his own ping go out, but the echo was a muddy, indistinct thud. It wasn't the sharp, metallic crack of a U-boat hull. He reported to his bridge. Contact, sir, but uncertain. It's a mushy return. Could be a dense thermal layer, or a whale. It's not a solid hull, sir. Definitely not a U-boat. Above them, the Harrier's captain, a man with 6 U-boat kills to his name, was impatient. He had a convoy to protect. He wasn't going to waste time and depth charges on a maybe. It's a whale sonar, forget it. Resume patrol pattern. The rhythmic pinging began to fade, moving off to the port. In the control room of U-997, the crew was in a state of suspended animation. They had been holding their breath, muscles clenched. Nothing happened. The pinging grew fainter and fainter, and then it was gone. They were through the screen, just like that. A young lookout, his face slick with sweat, whispered, "Got him, Himmel." Reinhardt slowly, unbelievingly raised the periscope. He wiped the eyepiece as if to clear his vision. There it was, not 2,000 meters away, the convoy, a sea of fat, slow-moving merchant ships, and beyond them, the stern of HMS Harrier, steaming away, completely oblivious. He had done it. The madman had done it. He had piloted a 700-ton steel submarine right through an active destroyer screen, and they had mistaken him for a whale. Reinhardt lowered the periscope, his hands shaking. He looked at von Stoiber. The scientist was cleaning his glasses on his tie. You see, Kapitän? The physics are sound. The ocean is a symphony of noise. We are simply the one note that is missing. And that, he said, tapping his temple, is more terrifying to an orchestra than a note played out of tune. The fear that had paralyzed the crew began to transform. It crystallized into something new, something cold and sharp. It was the dawning, terrible realization of their own power. They were not the hunted. They were not sheep hiding from the wolves. They were the true wolf, a creature that could not be seen, could not be heard. A ghost. A void. Reinhardt felt a shiver run down his spine, a thrill that was equal parts exultation and terror. He looked at his crew. Their eyes were wide, no longer with fear, but with a wild, predatory gleam. They were the crew of Das Gespenst. Battle stations, Reinhardt said, his voice a low growl, utterly changed. Target the lead freighter, but that is not our primary target. He pointed on the chart, not at the fat tankers, but at the symbol for the destroyer harried. We will take the Shepherd first. Torpedo room, stand by. We are going back through the screen. The torpedo officer looked at him, his eyes wide. To attack an escort, unprovoked, at close range? It was suicide. But Reinhardt was already a different man. He was no longer a survivor. He was a hunter. U-997 turned, its silent, revolutionary propellers biting into the black water, and began to stalk the warship that, just minutes before, had dismissed it as an anomaly. The Allies had built a fence to keep the wolves out. They had no idea that von Stuber's monster was already inside, and it was about to teach them a new and profound definition of terror. The hunter had become the ghost, and the ghost was about to bare its teeth. The control room of U-997 had transformed. The tomb-like silence, once a source of dread, was now a weapon. It was the sound of apex predation. Every man moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, their actions precise, their voices hushed to conspiratorial whispers. This was not the frantic, shouting chaos of a normal U-boat attack. This was the cold, focused work of assassins. Erich Reinhardt, his eye pressed to the attack periscope, was a statue. He no longer saw a rubber coffin. He saw a scalpel, and aimed at the throat of HMS Harrier. Bearing 015, he murmured. His voice was barely audible, yet it filled the compartment. Range 1200. Angle on the bow. Starboard 30. She is on her patrol leg. She's blind, gentlemen, utterly blind. He could see the British warship clearly. It was a gray, functional killer, smoke chuffing from its single stack, its aft hedgehog mortars loaded and ready. He could see the lookouts on the bridge, bundled against the cold, sweeping the gray seas with binoculars. They were looking for a periscope. They were listening for an engine. They were hunting a ghost that was already behind them. Torpedo room, status, Reinhardt commanded. The reply was a crisp whisper from the voice pipe. Tubes 1 and 2 ready. G-70's torpedoes, electric. Set for 4 meters depth. Electric torpedoes, another layer of silence. No bubbly wake to give them away. Von Stauber stood near the navigation table, his arms crossed. He was not looking at the periscope or the gauges. He was watching the men. He was observing the human component of his experiment. He saw the sonar man, Hannes, who had been a trembling wreck just 10 minutes prior. Now, Hannes was leaning forward, headphones pressed to his head, a look of intense, almost godlike concentration on his face. He was listening to the Harrier's screws, tracking its every move. He was a blind man who had been given the gift of perfect sight. She is steady, Captain, Hannes reported. Her port screw has a slight tick, a bent blade perhaps, but she is steady. She hears nothing. Reinhardt made a final calculation. Attacking a destroyer, a ship built specifically to kill him, was a violation of every U-boat doctrine. But doctrine was written by men who made noise. Solution is set, the weapons officer confirmed. Reinhardt took one last look. The destroyer filled his vision. He could smell the salt and the diesel. He could almost hear the wind howling across its bridge. Tube 1. Feuer. There was no jolt, only a slight, pressurized whoosh that the hull barely registered. A bubble of compressed air, and the first eel was away. Tube 2. Fewer. The second torpedo followed its twin, two G7s, running silent, running deep, streaking toward the oblivious hunter. "All stop," Reinhardt ordered. "Take us down. 20 meters. Silent." The hum of the electric motors ceased. U-9997 became a 700-ton piece of dead, unfeeling metal, suspended in the cold Atlantic, its rubber skin absorbing the faint, curious pings of the Harrier's distant sonar. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The control room was so quiet that the metallic click of the stopwatch in Reinhardt's hand was a gunshot. 40 seconds. 50. The torpedoes were running. The crew waited. They were gods of the deep, having thrown their lightning. Now they waited for the thunder. Above them, on the bridge of HMS Harrier, the lookout on the starboard wing suddenly stiffened. He pointed, his mouth open to shout, but he was too late. Two thin, pale lines of disturbed water, the tracks of the electric torpedoes, were already inside the ship's turning circle. The captain, alerted by the shout, was just turning his head when the world vaporized. The first torpedo struck just aft of the bridge, collapsing the officer's wardroom and rupturing the primary boiler. The explosion was catastrophic. The second G7Es hit seconds later, directly beneath the aft depth charge racks. The result was a sympathetic detonation of unimaginable violence. The Harrier, a 500-ton warship, was lifted bodily out of the water. Its spine snapped. The entire stern section, along with its propellers and depth charges, simply vanished in a blinding yellow-white fireball. The ship, broken in two, its siren screaming a death wail that was cut off in a burst of steam, was gone in under 30 seconds. It didn't just sink, it was executed. In the control room of U-997, the shockwave hit them like a physical blow. The pressure hull rang, not like a bell, but a dull, heavy gong, the sound muffled by von Steuber's tiles. Gauges rattled, dust fell from the overhead, and the crew were thrown against their stations. "Hull integrity, check all compartments," Reinhardt roared, his composure momentarily broken by the sheer, ungodly violence of the explosion. Hannes had ripped his headphones off, his ears bleeding, the sound of the Harrier's death scream having been transmitted directly into his skull. But von Steuber was smiling, a thin, wolfish grin, as he made a note in his logbook. "Acoustic trauma," he wrote. "Acceptable." The terror had begun. But it wasn't just on the now sunken Harrier. It was on the bridges of the two remaining escorts, HMS Vulture and HMS Scythe. Their radio operators were screaming into their microphones. Their sonar rooms were in chaos. Harrier was gone, vanished, sunk. But by what? There had been no sonar contact, no hydrophone warning, no periscope sighted, no engine noise, nothing. It was as if the ocean itself had reached up and swatted the ship from existence. The Vulture's captain, a commander named Davies, was a veteran of the Dunkirk evacuation and the Murmansk runs. He had seen it all. He had never seen this. "Sonar, what do you have?" he bellowed. The reply was panicked. "Nothing, sir. I mean nothing. There is no U-boat. The Harrier. It just blew up." "There's no screw beats, no. Nothing." A young ensign, his face white, said, "Sir, could it have been a new mine? An acoustic mine?" Davies shook his head, his mind racing. "Mines don't hunt, not in the middle of the Atlantic." "Scythe," he radioed to his other destroyer. "Form a search pattern. It's a submarine. It has to be. But how do you hunt what you cannot find? How do you fight a phantom?" The two destroyers began their hunt, not with precision, but with rage. They were terrified. If Harrier could be hit, so could they. They were blind. The ping of their ASDIC, their electronic shield, was useless. It was like shouting into a fog and hearing no echo. They began a saturation hunt. They crisscrossed the last known position of the Harrier, dropping depth charges not on a target, but on a guess. They were bombing the ocean. Boom, crump, boom. The explosions hammered the water, a desperate, furious tantrum. Down below, U-997 was enduring hell. Each depth charge was a universe of pain. The boat was kicked, slammed, and rattled. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation cracked and fell from the bulkheads. A small leak sprang in the aft torpedo room. But von Steuber's design, his floating deck, was working. The engines and motors were protected from the worst of the shocks. And the Schattenhaut, his rubber skin, was having an unpredicted side effect. The explosions, while still terrifying, felt muffled. The sharp, hull-cracking crack of a close proximity charge was dampened into a bone-jarring thud. The hull was not ringing, which saved the crew's sanity and the delicate instruments. "They are hunting blind," Reinhardt said, his voice tense as another charge detonated, this one closer. "They are just dropping them on the wreckage, praying." Von Steuber, holding onto a pipe to steady himself, was calmly timing the intervals between the explosions. "They are panicking, Capitan. Look at the pattern. It is incoherent. They are not hunting us. They are trying to comfort themselves. They are making noise to fill the silence. The silence. Our silence. It is breaking them." He was right. For 2 hours the destroyers raged. They expended their entire supply of depth charges, and they found nothing. Not a ripple, not an oil slick, not a single definitive ping of a submerged steel hull. U-997, meanwhile, had crept away. At 2 knots, running at a depth of 150 meters, the boat was a ghost in their own baffles. The silent propellers left no cavitation, no hiss. The rubber skin swallowed their desperate pings. The internal machinery was a whisper beneath the roar of the ocean's own background noise. Reinhardt had taken them under the convoy, a move so brazen, so suicidal in a normal U-boat, that the destroyers never even considered it. They were hunting in the quiet water, while U-997 was hiding in the noise of the merchant's own propellers. When Reinhardt finally raised the periscope 8 hours later, the ocean was empty. The convoy was a smear of smoke on the horizon. The destroyers, their depth charge racks empty and their nerves shot, were gone. They had returned to the convoy, defeated and terrified. U-997 was alone. They had sunk a state-of-the-art destroyer from inside its own defensive screen and had escaped without a scratch. The crew, exhausted, bruised, but vibrating with a new terrifying energy, looked at each other. They were no longer sailors. They were something else. They were the crew of a ghost ship. Reinhardt turned to von Steuber. He didn't salute. He just nodded. A deep, profound gesture of respect that was heavier than any metal. "Doctor," he said, his voice hoarse, "get your equations ready. I am taking us home." The first patrol of U-997 was over. It had lasted 4 days, and in those 4 days, Karl von Steuber had not just sunk a destroyer. He had sunk the entire foundation of Allied anti-submarine warfare. He had destroyed their confidence. He had proven that their multi-million-pound technological shield was as useless as a wooden fence against a phantom. The Kriegsmarine now had its miracle, and the Allies, though they didn't know it yet, had a new existential terror. A submarine that could not be found. A silent killer that could be anywhere, even right next to them, listening, waiting, its torpedo tubes open. The war in the Atlantic had just changed, and the wild Inventor was holding the pen. The sinking of HMS Harrier was not just a loss. It was a cognitive bomb that detonated in the deepest, most secure chambers of the Allied war effort. The first report from Commander Davies of the Vulture was met with disbelief. It was filed, then reread, then flagged as combat hysteria. A destroyer, gone. No sonar, no hydrophone, no warning. It was, by the laws of physics as the Royal Navy understood them, an impossibility. But then the survivors were pulled from the oily, freezing water, men with ruptured eardrums, flash burns, and a 1,000-yard stare. They told the same story. There was nothing. One moment they were on patrol. The next, they were in the sky, surrounded by a wall of fire. The ocean was empty. The sonar operators from Vulture and Scythe were sequestered and debriefed for 72 hours straight. They were pale, trembling men, chain-smoking and insisting, almost weeping, that their equipment was flawless. "I've been on the scopes for 3 years, sir," one chief petty officer told the Board of Inquiry, his voice cracking. "I can tell you the species of fish that swims by a rivet on our hull. I can hear a U-boat Capitan cough. I tell you, sir, there was nothing there. The sea was. dead, and then the Harrier died. A new and terrible kind of fear began to spread through the destroyer fleets. It was a fear not of the known, but of the unknown. Before, the war in the Atlantic was a terrifying but understandable equation. The U-boat was a loud, clumsy diesel and steel predator. The Allies were the precise, technological hunters. The ping of the Aztec was their shepherd's crook, their all-seeing eye. It was the sound of safety, of control. Now, Karl von Steuber had inverted the entire psychological framework of the war. He had weaponized silence. The ping was no longer a comfort. It was a terrifying question mark. And when the ocean failed to answer, when the ping went out and was simply swallowed by the void, the silence that followed was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of a monster lurking. It was the sound of a gun pressed to the back of your head. Sailors on watch, scanning the gray waves, began to jump at shadows. Sonar operators, their nerves frayed to the breaking point, began reporting mushy contacts, whales, thermal layers, all of which were now treated as existential threats. Was that a school of fish? Or it? Was that a pocket of cold water? Or the Schattenhaut? The ghost of the Atlantic was born, a legend whispered in the mess halls from Liverpool to Halifax. Morale, which had been high, began to crack. The hunters were now terrified of the dark. Meanwhile, U-997 slipped back into the U-boat pens at La Pallas like a scalpel being returned to its case. There was no celebration, no penance. The crew was whisked away under armed guard, not to the bars and brothels, but to a secure debriefing facility. The U-boat itself was winched from the water into a concrete bunker, the massive steel doors sealed, and the bunker's existence erased from official records. Karl von Steuber, his clothes rumpled and his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes blazing with the fire of vindication, found himself sitting opposite the one man he had always tried to impress. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. The Admiral, his face etched with the strain of a losing war, listened without interruption. He heard Reinhardt's clinical, tactical report of the sinking. He heard the analysis of the Allied saturation bombing and how it had failed. Then he turned to von Steuber. "Doctor," Dönitz said, his voice flat, "you were correct. Your methods are no longer in question." He pushed a file across the desk. "This is a new design, the type Luxuman. It is an electro-boot. It is designed to live, fight, and die beneath the surface. It will be the savior of the Reich. Your technology, your shadow skin, your silent drive. You will integrate it. You are no longer a researcher, Doctor. You are now the single most important engineer in the Kriegsmarine." For Karl von Steuber, it was the moment his entire life had been building toward. He was no longer Der Wild. He was the prophet. He was given unlimited resources, a blank check, and the authority to requisition anything and anyone. He was moved from his dusty workshop to the head of a massive, sprawling research and production facility at the Deschimag shipyard in Bremen. And it was there, in the transition from pure, isolated genius to industrial-scale manager, that the ghost in the machine began to encounter a new and far more insidious enemy, the bureaucracy of the war machine. Von Steuber was a physicist. He was not a politician. He saw the world in absolutes. A thing was either silent or it was not. A hull was either invisible or it was a target. The men from Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments, however, saw the world in production quotas and schedules. They arrived in crisp suits, carrying clipboards, and they were horrified by von Steuber's methods. "Doctor," one particularly odious procurement official named Herr Globke explained, "your Schattenhaut tiles require a 4-day curing process. This is unacceptable. We have found a new adhesive that cures in 12 hours. The project must meet its quota." Von Steuber was apoplectic. That adhesive is brittle. It will crack at 100 meters. It will trap microbubbles. It will whistle. Do you want to build a U-boat or a flute?" The battles were endless. Von Steuber fought for every component. He insisted on the complex, 7-bladed, variable pitch propellers, each one milled from a single, perfect billet of bronze, a process that took 2 weeks per propeller. The ministry presented a simpler, 5-bladed cast design. "It is 90% as efficient, Doctor, and can be produced in 1/10 the time." Von Steuber threw the blueprint at the official's head. 90%. That 10% difference is the sound. It is the cavitation. It is the hiss that will get every one of these men killed. You are not building a weapon. You are building a compromise. His most ferocious battle was over the floating deck. His design for U-997 was a cradle, a bespoke, custom-fitted system of rubber bearings and hydraulic dampeners that isolated the entire power plant from the hull. It was an engineering masterpiece. It was also a manufacturing nightmare. It took 3 extra weeks to install. The ministry, desperate to get the new Type Joint 1s into the Atlantic, bypassed him. They implemented a standardized system of simple rubber gaskets and mounts. It was quieter than a Type 7, to be sure. It absorbed perhaps 60% of the vibration, but it was not silent. It was not von Steuber's ghost. It was a muffled machine. The wild inventor, the savior of the Kriegsmarine, was suddenly Der Wilde all over again. He was the obstructionist. He was the mad perfectionist standing in the way of practical victory. He was ranting in hallways about acoustic integrity while bombs were falling on Bremen. He wrote scathing, insubordinate memos to Dönitz, to Speer, even to Himmler's office, accusing the procurement officials of murder by spreadsheet. He was warned, then he was silenced. One cold morning in late 1944, Herr Globke arrived at von Steuber's office, flanked by 2 SS guards. "Doctor, your contributions have been invaluable, but your passion is becoming counterproductive. You are being reassigned. A new theoretical acoustics project in Berlin. You will leave in 1 hour." Von Steuber was ruined. He was cast out of his own revolution. He watched from the window of a staff car as the first of the new Type 1 electroboot was launched. It was a marvel of engineering, sleek and deadly. It was coated in a simplified, mass-produced version of his Schattenhaut. It was fitted with the cast, 5-bladed propellers. It was powered by engines resting on standardized rubber gaskets. And to Karl von Steuber, it was the loudest, most disgusting, most tragic sound in the world. It was the sound of his perfect, beautiful silence being corrupted, compromised, and sent out to die. The Allies, in their terror, had not been idle. Their best minds had been locked in a room, tasked with one mission: find the ghost. If ASDIC was obsolete, they needed something new. They began deploying massive static hydrophone arrays on the seabed of the Giuki Gap. They retrained their sonar operators, not to listen for a ping, but to listen for the absence of sound, to identify the dead spots in the ocean's ambient noise. But their most important discovery came from the failure of their enemy. When the first of the new, compromised Type V Quins went on patrol, the Allied listeners were waiting, and they heard something. It wasn't the loud thump, thump, thump of a Type 7. It was a very faint, very high-frequency whine. It was the sound of the standardized gaskets vibrating at a frequency von Steuber had predicted. It was the subtle, high-pitched hiss of the easier propellers. It was the sound of compromise. It was a new acoustic fingerprint. A quiet fingerprint, but a fingerprint nonetheless. In January 1945, U-2501, a brand new Type 21, was on its first patrol, its commander arrogant, believing himself to be invisible. He was hunted by a new specialist Allied task force. They didn't use sonar. They used a passive hydrophone net. They detected the faint whine. They triangulated it. They didn't waste time with depth charges. They launched a salvo of squid ahead-throwing mortars, a weapon designed to saturate an area in a pattern of instantaneous, bone-crushing concussions. U-2501, the miracle weapon, was crushed like a tin can before it had ever fired a torpedo. The ghost had a sound, and now the Allies knew how to hunt it. All because, in the end, the bureaucracy had chosen to build a cheaper flute rather than a perfect, silent void. While Karl von Steuber sat in his new office, a cold concrete-walled room in a bombed-out suburb of Berlin, his original masterpiece, U-997, was a forgotten prisoner. She was too perfect, too unique. She was not a production model. She was an anomaly, a hybrid Type 7C that had been built by a madman's hands. She was a scalpel in a war that now demanded sledgehammers. The Kriegsmarine, in its death throes, was obsessed with the mass-produced Type 1 wins, the miracle that was proving to be just another flawed, desperate gamble. U-997, the rubber duck, the Ghost, was deemed too specialized, its systems too unconventional for a new crew. Her revolutionary engine mounts were a maintenance nightmare for shipyard workers who didn't understand them. Her perfect propellers were irreplaceable. Her Schattenhaut tiles, applied with von Stoiber's proprietary slow-curing adhesive, were peeling after the depth charge attack, and no one knew the correct chemical formula to repair them. The boat was a relic, a testament to a perfection that the war had no time for. She was cannibalized. Her advanced hydrophones were stripped for a Type 21. Her custom-made periscope was transferred to a boat leaving for a suicide mission. She was left to rust, tied up in a forgotten corner of the La Palisse pens, a silent, dethroned queen. In Berlin, von Stoiber was a ghost himself. He was a man out of time, a Cassandra screaming warnings that no one would listen to. He sat at a bare desk, ordered to write theoretical papers on future acoustic possibilities. It was a prison of boredom, a bureaucratic gulag. He would spend his nights listening to the BBC, listening to the Allied news reports, analyzing the reports of U-boat losses. He knew how they were being sunk. He could hear the failure of his own compromised designs in the cold, dispassionate voice of the British announcer. Another 3 Electroboot were reported sunk in the North Atlantic. Allied anti-submarine forces report continued success. He could see it all, a clear, terrible vision. He saw the Allied sonar operator, headphones pressed tight, ignoring the sonar ping and just listening for the high-frequency whine of the standardized engine gaskets, listening for the faint cavitation hiss from the cast-iron propellers. He was listening for the sound of Herr Globke's production schedule. He was listening for the sound of compromise. Von Stoiber, in his rage, scrawled a final furious memorandum. It was not a technical paper. It was a condemnation. He titled it, "On the Acoustic Signature of Failure." He detailed, with mathematical precision, exactly why the Type Thundiatans were dying. He proved that the shortcuts, the efficiencies of the ministry, had created a new, predictable acoustic fingerprint that the Allies had, as he knew they would, isolated and learned to hunt. "You have not built a fleet of silent ghosts," he wrote. "You have built a fleet of identical whispering victims. You have painted a target on the back of every U-boat commander. Your victory is a mass grave." He handed the report to his SS liaison. It was the last official act of his career. 2 days later, the air raid sirens wailed their final desperate cry over Berlin. The Red Army was in the suburbs. The world was ending. In the chaos, von Stoiber's guards vanished, called to a front line that was now just a few streets away. Karl von Stoiber, der Wilde, the man who had perfected silence, simply walked out of his office. He was a gaunt specter in a tattered suit, picking his way through the rubble of the dying Third Reich. He was a man without a purpose, a genius whose miracle had been stolen, corrupted, and turned into a failure. He was last seen walking west toward the American lines, muttering to himself about wave propagation and the porous skin of whales. He vanished into the fog of war, his ultimate fate, like that of his perfect submarine, lost to the official records. But the legend, the terror he had unleashed, did not die. After the war, when the Allies secured the U-boat pens at La Palisse, they found her. U-997. She was a wreck, partially scuttled by the fleeing Germans, listing in the murky water. But she was intact enough. A team of U.S. Navy engineers and British acousticians, men who had spent the last 2 years living in fear of the ghost of the Atlantic, boarded her. They were like priests entering a haunted temple. What they found stunned them. This was not a Type Chardorn. This was something else. They saw the shadow skin, the Schattenhaut, and they were amazed at its complexity, its layered, absorbent design. It was decades ahead of their own anechoic coatings, but it was when they unbolted the engine room deck plates that the lead American engineer, a man named Commander Elliott, simply stopped. He knelt, his flashlight beam cutting through the damp, oily darkness. He was not looking at gaskets. He was looking at a cradle. A massive, fully articulated, hydraulically dampened floating deck. The entire multi-ton engine and motor assembly was isolated from the hull, a ship within a ship. He touched one of the massive rubber bearings, still intact. "My God," he whispered. No wonder we couldn't hear him. He wasn't on the hull, the vibrations. They just died in here. They found the workshop logs, the meticulous, insane notes of von Steuber. They found the blueprints for the original hand-milled silent propellers. They began to realize the truth. The Type 20 ones they had been hunting, those were a pale, noisy imitation. This U-9997 was the real thing. It was a perfect predator, and they had never found it. The sinking of the Harrier wasn't a fluke. It was a demonstration. The terror, which had subsided with the defeat of the Type 20 Bulls, returned, but this time it was a cold, strategic terror in the halls of the Pentagon and the Admiralty. It was the horrifying realization that if Karl von Steuber had been listened to, if the Kriegsmarine had built a fleet of these, the war would have been lost. There would have been no D-Day. There would have been no supply line. The North Atlantic would have become a silent German lake. The wild inventor had been right. His genius had been so far ahead of its time that his own side couldn't understand it, and in their ignorance they had saved the Allies. U-997 was towed, under the highest secrecy, to the United States. She was studied, reverse-engineered, and her principles became the holy grail of submarine warfare. Karl von Steuber's ideas, the Schattenhaut, the floating deck, the focus on total acoustic isolation, became the foundation of the entire Cold War submarine race. The race for silence, the American Skipjack class, the Soviet Victor class. They were all in their DNA, the children of Karl von Steuber's rubber duck. His ghost still haunted the deep. The wild inventor, derided and dismissed, had single-handedly written the rules for the next 50 years of naval warfare from a dusty, forgotten workshop, a man obsessed with the silence of whales. He had created a submarine so perfect, so terrifying, that his own nation was too inefficient to build it, and the Allies were saved, not by their own technology, but by the very bureaucracy that had crushed the inventor's spirit.